afraid. Then I sing, 'cause I know. Yeah, I sing, 'cause I know. Then I sing, 'cause I know. I know I'm free. I know I'm free. I know I'm free.
Someone asked me the other day, with everything that's been happening in Syria and between Turkey and Syria, how the Turks have gone into Syria and started to attack the Kurdish people who've been our allies for so long now. I've been in that region, and I crossed that border from Turkey into Syria on my bicycle back in the early 90s, and someone was asking me about what that was like, and I got me thinking about it, and I recalled how it was a little bit scary, kind of intense crossing that border. I crossed a lot of borders on that bicycle trip back in the 90s when I was traveling around the world. But in Syria, they asked some very deliberate questions, first on a form in writing and then verbally. And they would ask these questions sometimes 3 different ways, to ask the same question to try to trip you up or make sure that they got a true answer from you. And if they didn't like the answer to the question, they would not let you in. And it was interesting because on a bicycle, if they didn't let me in, it was going to be a long way to get somewhere else. And one of the questions that they'd ask was, are you going to occupied Palestine, which is the name they call Israel? And if you say yes, forget about it. You can't go in. And now, of course, I was going to Israel, but I knew what would happen, so I lied. They also asked what was my religion. Of course, I wasn't going to tell them that I'm Jewish on my father's side of the family. I figured that probably wouldn't be a good thing. And in fact, I realized I wasn't so sure I wanted to tell them I was a Unitarian Universalist because I didn't know what they'd think of that. So I just told them I was Christian, and that seemed to be satisfactory, and they let me come in. I bicycled then through Syria, through Jordan, into Egypt and Israel. And it was an amazing experience. And with that in mind, I've been thinking about how I've often identified myself as a border walker. And I've often talked about us, members of All Souls in this community, as all being border walkers in some way, people who religiously and culturally live en la frontera, or on the border between ethnicities and cultures, religious expressions, and other identities. It's a powerful and sometimes painful and even dangerous place to live on the border. When we are on the border, we can feel that we have to compromise our values or hide parts of ourselves. Being on the border, we can be tempted to and even betray ourselves or our people. This came up for me this week when I began to write a message about changing the name of the holiday that we call Columbus Day to Indigenous Peoples Day. The thinking being, why do we want to celebrate the supposed discovery of the Americas that resulted in the colonization of the Americas, the beginning of the transatlantic slave trade, and the deaths of millions due to murder and disease? Now, several United States cities have already replaced Columbus Day with alternative days of remembrance. Alaska, Hawaii, Oregon, and South Dakota have officially replaced Columbus Day with Indigenous Peoples Day, as have cities like Denver, Phoenix, and Los Angeles. In many Latin American countries, the anniversary of Columbus's landing has traditionally been observed as Dia de la Raza, or Day of the Race, a celebration of Hispanic culture's diverse origins. In 2002, Venezuela renamed the holiday Dia de la Resistencia Indígena, Day of Indigenous Resistance, to recognize the native peoples and their experience. So here we are in Oklahoma, where our license plates say Native American country. So I began to make the case for change here. It seemed pretty straightforward. In fact, it was so straightforward that I thought, I want to look up what in the world people are saying to kind of argue for keeping Columbus Day in this day and age. So I learned in the process that Columbus Day, the holiday, began as a national holiday in 1937, so not really that long ago. And it was promoted mostly by Italian Americans to provide a sense of dignity and self-worth in the light of the hostility and the discrimination that many Italian immigrants and Italian Americans and Catholics more broadly faced as they tried to become a part of the American story. They were seen as others. They didn't belong. And so this was an opportunity many saw to say, we're part of this story too. Now, I'm Italian American on my mother's side. If you've seen me standing up in the ritual we do to honor those who have died, I've been standing up for this past year for my uncle, Jimmy Sansabrino Jr., who, we're Southern Italian. That Sansabrino with the O at the end signifies that. And there are many of us Sansabrinos on the East Coast of the United States, particularly around Connecticut. Now, I've known from the early years of immigration of Italians into North America that there was a lot of discrimination around jobs and housing, lots of kind of attitudes of prejudice against Italians, but I never really read much about it or knew much about it. And so, interestingly enough, exploring the holiday of Columbus Day and how it started, I learned some things. Without a doubt, Italian immigrants, especially Southern Italian immigrants, were not considered white or American in the early decades of this American experiment. The most shocking thing that I learned was of a mass lynching of Southern Italian Americans in New Orleans, which was said to be the largest act of lynching in America's violent history. That's the understanding of lynching is expanding to include a lot more than this, and so I would say it's one of the largest single episodes of lynching in American history. A mob of 10,000 angry men surrounded a New Orleans jail, shouting angry slurs and calling for blood. It was 1891, the same era that my great-grandparents and my grandfather, Jimmy Sansabrino Sr., immigrated from southern Italy. Now, as horrendous of an act of vigilante violence this was in New Orleans, it's important to realize that there are more than 5,000 documented cases of lynchings in the United States from 1882 to 1968, most of them of African American men. Let's just take a second to just absorb that and feel the weight and the significance of that number and that history of violence. So on March 14th, 1891 was one of the worst moments in the United States' long history of anti-Italian discrimination. It began after the murder of a popular chief of police whose name was David Hennessy. He was killed while walking home from work. And as he was dying, right there on the sidewalk, a witness asked him who did it. Dagos, he is reported to have whispered, a word that is a slur for Italians. Over the next few hours, the police rounded up hundreds of Italians. Newspapers stoked the flames of anger and vengeance and prejudice. The media declared 9 of these men who were arrested on suspicion to be guilty before trial, and they demanded justice. The men were eventually acquitted, And that's when thousands of angry New Orleans residents gathered near the jail. Speakers brought the mob to an emotional frenzy. The speeches described Italian-American immigrants as dangerous and criminal and vermin. They needed to be exterminated, they said, and run out of the city. Before long, the mob broke into the city's arsenal, stealing guns and ammunition. They shouted, "We want the Dagos." They broke into the prison, and they not only pulled out the 9 men who had been acquitted, but also other Italian men that they found there. By the time that the sounds of hundreds of gunshots stopped ringing out, 11 men were riddled with bullets and were being torn apart by the crowd. People cheered as their bodies were mutilated and the corpses were hung for display. A warning to other Italians. An editorial in the New York Times called the victims desperate ruffians and murderers. These sneaking and cowardly Sicilians, they said, the descendants of bandits and assassins, are to us pests without mitigation. A grand jury said that the mob was made up of some of New Orleans' most prominent residents, including future mayors and governors. They wrote in their decision that, quote, "the crowd included some of the first, best, and even the most law-abiding of the citizens of the city." Yet they claimed that none of the killers could be identified. No one was ever held responsible. No one was ever punished. A very common story in America's long history of lynching. Many Italians were also pursued by the Ku Klux Klan as Catholics, because that was a major target of the Klan along with African Americans, even right here in Tulsa. And about 250 Italians were interned during World War II here in the United States for up to 2 years in military camps in Montana, here in Oklahoma, Tennessee, and Texas, along with Japanese Americans. I find it fascinating that in going about trying to learn and advocate for what I saw as someone else's history, I came to learn a lot of things about my own. I also learned that Columbus Day has not been a national holiday for very long here in this country. And I learned that for many Italian Americans, celebrating Columbus Day is for them a way of honoring an Italian explorer who played a central role in the founding of what has become the United States of America. For many Italians, it's how they have seen their heritage being given some credence and how it finally became woven into the multicultural fabric and story of the United States of America, which has become a nation made up of people of every nation. Now, some Italian-American organizations, such as the National Italian-American Foundation, see the recent defacing of statues of Columbus and the elimination of the holiday as an attempt to erase perhaps the most significant Italian figure from the story of how this nation was formed. They have publicly stated that they wholeheartedly support the founding of a National Indigenous Peoples Day and ask that it be added to the national calendar without having to do away with Columbus Day. Did I mention that being a border walker is risky and painful and sometimes dangerous? Now, since we are border walkers, we have to be especially careful not to betray ourselves or our people. So in the time that I have left, I want to explain why, despite my Italian-American heritage, I am a strong advocate of changing Columbus Day to Indigenous Peoples Day. Already for me, that's what I call it, and that's what I'm calling this weekend. So the problem with our country stopping everything to celebrate Christopher Columbus and the discovery of America is that the notion that you can discover something that's already known and exists is one of the most devastating aspects of colonization. In legal and historic terms, there's something known as the doctrine of discovery. It's a concept of international law that says that European Christian nations can lay claim to lands that were occupied by people who were not already under the sovereignty of a Christian European monarch. In other words, it was a doctrine, both religious and political, under which European colonial powers legitimized to themselves the taking of land from indigenous people from the mid-15th all the way to the mid-20th centuries. U.S. Supreme Court Justice John Marshall noted in an 1823 decision on the discovery of this immense continent, the great nations of Europe, as they were all in pursuit of nearly the same object, it was necessary in order to avoid conflicting settlements and consequent war with each other, to establish a principle which all should acknowledge as the law by which the right of acquisition, which they all asserted should be regulated between themselves. This principle was that discovery gave title to the government of whose subjects, by whose authority it was made against all other European governments. So it was really a law to keep the Europeans from fighting each other over the lands of other people that they were taking. So in the formation of the United States of America, according to the Supreme Court, discovery gave an exclusive right to extinguish the Indians of title of occupancy either by purchase or by conquest. That's a quote from the Supreme Court. In his opinion in the case in 1823, Chief Justice Marshall stated, "The tribes of Indians inhabiting this country were fierce savages whose occupation was war, and whose subsistence was drawn chiefly from the forest. To leave them in possession of their country was to leave the country a wilderness." Now, it's worth noting that unlike many other overtly and blatantly racist court decisions from the 19th century, this decision has never been overturned. The doctrine has been cited by the United States Supreme Court as recently as 2005 in a case called City of Sherrill, New York versus the Oneida Nation. Now, in 2009, the General Convention of the Episcopal Church repudiated the doctrine of discovery. In 2012, our Unitarian Universalist Association's General Assembly in Phoenix, Arizona, passed a resolution repudiating the doctrine of discovery and calling on Unitarian Universalists to study the doctrine and eliminate its presence from the current day policies, programs, theologies, and structures of our churches and society. Since then, the United Church of Christ, the Christian Reformed Church, Presbyterian Church USA, and the Evangelical Lutheran churches in America have all repudiated this doctrine, if you will, of discovery. The doctrine mixes Christian theology and state power in a way that is still causing harm in our nation. So educating ourselves about this doctrine and repudiating it is part of decolonizing our minds as well as our country. It's a way of setting ourselves free from something that keeps us stuck and in bondage. It's not about helping one group over another group. It's about realizing that we are all victims of the vestiges and the violence of colonialism. So before I conclude, I want to share a passage on immigration from a message called "This Land is Your Land?" by my great colleague and friend, Reverend Colin Boson. He delivered this message a few years ago, and he explained, quote, "The whole debate about immigration in this country is predicated on the idea that the United States is the legitimate sovereign over a large part of North America. The government has demarcated borders and decided who can and cannot cross those borders, and uses violence and artificial barriers to enforce those borders. Many people who the United States government seeks to keep from crossing those borders are the descendants of the original inhabitants of this land. For hundreds of years, their ancestors flowed freely across the land, and now borders imposed by the United States restrict that movement. Those borders were established through the religiously and morally unacceptable doctrine of discovery when Europeans claimed that they discovered the land as their own. The descendants of the original inhabitants are now labeled as immigrants, while the descendants of the European colonizers claim to be its legitimate inhabitants. The hidden reality that needs to be discovered about the doctrine of discovery and the border system is that they are products of the human imagination. They are not real in the same way that a rock is real. They're not real in the same way that a river is real. They're not real in the same way that a human being is real. They are created in human minds. Borders. You can walk across them if you're lucky, if you have the right paperwork, if you have the right skin color, if you have the right passport or nationality. Reverend Boson goes on, this means that since they're created in human minds, it means that they can be uncreated in human minds. We can imagine a world in which they do not exist, where we may cease to define anyone as immigrants and instead see one another as human beings journeying through the same land together. We are not owners of the land, but its children, he says. All of us draw sustenance from the same earth, are blessed by the same sun, are nurtured by the same air, and sustained by the same water. That truth is bigger than any border. That truth is what unites us, whether we will it or not. Friends, today we welcome into the fellowship of this community, All Souls, and our family, new members. If you're one of those new members, in just a moment, I'm going to invite you to come forward onto the chancel, and we have a short ceremony for you. I'm going to ask you to bring your order of service or the piece for that ceremony up with you, and we're all going to participate in welcoming them. And we need to celebrate these new members because it's not easy living here on the border between cultures, between religions, between our other identities. We need one another as we live on this border and we push the boundaries of what that means. We need to listen to each other. We need to make room for each other. And we need to be willing to adapt to help set each other and ourselves free. Free from bad doctrines, free from systems of power that can destroy us and others. May we never, and may you never betray yourself. May we continue to widen the circle of who we see as my people and our people, so that my people become your people, and your people are my people, and we are one family upon this earth. On this Indigenous Peoples Day weekend, will those who have joined All Souls in the last few months, please come forward to be recognized on our chancel.
We're so happy you're visiting with us online today. We love connecting with people all across the country and around the world, sharing our powerful message of love beyond belief.
There's something new happening here. You can now join All Souls as a virtual member. Our virtual membership is designed for friends who live outside of Tulsa, Oklahoma, and who want to engage with All Souls in a meaningful way.
You can be part of an expanding family, a global family really, wherever you are. If you live in Oklahoma,
Ohio,
or Orange County, California,
Canada,
or Cameroon, by becoming A virtual member, you'll be able to deepen your connections with members and friends here in Tulsa and with members wherever you are.
Each week, you'll receive special All Souls content tailored for you, our virtual members. Virtual members have access to pastoral care, to personal prayers, and also receive invitations to exclusive web events.
You can learn more, and if you're ready, you can become a virtual member today by visiting allsoulschurch.org/virtual membership.
We're grateful our ministries are having a positive impact on your life, and we want to share the good news of love beyond belief with more and more people. So no matter what, we need your support to keep this ministry growing and thriving, so please consider making a gift today. You can do so by texting
LOVEBB for Love Beyond Belief to 73256 or simply visit our website. You are a blessing in our lives. May you be blessed.
and be a blessing.